when I did Potter, I kind of joined the train. It was halfway out the station.
Right.
And before I did Order of the Phoenix, which was my first one, I'd done a TV show called Sex Traffic. Yeah. So I finished Sex Traffic, and I said, and they phoned me up and said, we want you to direct Harry Potter. And I said, I've just done it.
Just want to thank everybody for doing this. I hope you're all excited, particularly because you're meeting me.
Yes.
All right?
Yes.
Okay. So I guess I'll start off with you.
Okay.
Because I'll start with you just because I watched your film Under the Shadows, and I wanted to. Is that your first? Forgive me. Is that your first feature?
Yeah, it's my first feature.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think, and this is to everybody, I think your first feature should be your true voice, because I guess when you get into the industry, you're gonna get so many different kind of films, and it doesn't mean you don't love them, but this is your first sort of outing into the world, and I want to know why you decided to do Under the Shadow as yours.
Well, for that reason, because the idea stems from a very personal place. I was born in Tehran in Iran right in the middle of the Iran-Iraq war, so it's just basically tapping into those sort of childhood memories. And I thought, as a first feature, it needs to be something that I'm passionate about, and that has those sort of personal touches, and that's exactly why I went for such an idea.
Yeah. Can you tell me about your first feature and why you decided? What was it that made you go, this is what I want to?
I came out of film school, and I was developing lots of scripts and writing. Actually, I was writing my own scripts, and I was just trying to find something that excited me and moved me. And so I came across this guy called Joe Fisher, and he'd written this script that just excited me, basically. It was about this guy who pretended to be someone else, and it was a fascinating period piece. And I was moved by the writing, and I was moved by this central character, and that got me excited. So that's where I started. And I was able to take some of it back to the north of England where I grew up. So I was able to film in Liverpool and surround myself with some of the people that I'd made all my earlier little short films with. And so that was really fun and good. But yeah, it's for me, it's always the writing and the characters and the people I feel I can engage with and be moved by, and who I believe. And that's the thing that always gets me out of bed and makes me want to make something.
It's difficult to tell what my first feature was. I prefer to think of something I did for television as my first feature, my first dramatised film, having spent 20 odd years before that as a documentary maker. I made a film back in 1984 called Threads, which is about a nuclear war, nuclear attack on a specific place in English City, Sheffield. And it just followed two families, a middle-class family and a working-class family, whose kids were joined by the fact that there was a pregnancy, an unwanted pregnancy. And that kind of gave a human view to the unimaginable happening. And I made it because I had a baby due, my first child, and I thought, well, this is a terrible world. What can I do with my skills to try and make it a less terrible world? Actually, tell the truth that had been kind of not told. This is what we face if things go wrong, and show it through the lives of ordinary people. And had tremendous success, I mean, in just scaring the stuffing out of people, which was partly the intention.
Exactly, right.
I had, an idea that I wanted to make, and it just happened to be not exactly the usual kind of project. And that was my first film, so I don't have much experience in, or distance to it. But I felt also that I had to, have a voice that's not like others. Well, not because I think I do have it. It's just that how much space I give to it, in my approach to filmmaking. So I think this video might have a educational purpose also. No, this is the purpose of it. So it's I always encourage other people who are starting the directing to really defend their own approach to it. Otherwise, you know, a lot of films are getting more and more standardization or uniformization, and I feel that that's important to preserve the unique point of view of a director.
I totally agree. I think there's a sort of corporatization of storytelling. It's becoming really efficient and sort of, and I totally agree.
It would be so nice to have a little bit more of a director's film industry and a little bit less of a producer's film industry. I feel that. You know.
More authorship, yeah.
How do you feel about some directors, especially because there are a lot of directors who are doing their first film, their smaller films, and then they're getting propelled into studio land. And sometimes it's a success in terms of a good film, not box office, in terms of a good film. As you've worked in the studio system, do you think it's because it's just too much, too soon? Or do you think the director doesn't, when they're so new, they don't have much of a say and it's all studio?
I think it's all about the environment that you enter as a director and the people that you work with, the producers and the studio. And if they're supportive and if they hire you and encourage you to come and tell the story that they want you to tell, but using your voice. I think what often happens, and this is not my experience, is by talking to some other directors, they hire you because you have a unique tone or sensibility or idea about how you want to interpret a story. But the minute you go through the door, they then don't want that. They want you to do it their way. That's not been my experience. Based on, I know you say it's important to have a directors-driven industry. I have to say that based on a sort of incredibly supportive bunch of producers, basically, who recognise what I want to bring and support it 100%. So but I don't think that's universal or general. I think, unfortunately, the typical experience from what I can perceive talking to other directors is that when you make a smaller film or asked to do a bigger film, the very thing they hire you for, they then don't want, because they want it to conform to a mathematical pattern that makes them feel safe. And yet they fell in love with you because of that singularity that you had in the first place.
We love what you do, but come here and don't do it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I have actually a specific question from you and Mick, because you guys have tons of experience in the studio world. How do you deal with notes from above?
How do you deal with notes?
Yeah.
You listen to them. You listen to them, and then you listen to yourself. And it's the dialogue that happens inside your head that's the main one. I think it actually does a director good. It has done me good in my career to go from a tiny film to a big film to a completely different film each time, rather than stick with a genre. I think the terror that comes from doing something you've never done before is a very great spurt of creativity. So I love going back into television and doing much smaller things, having done a big thing like The Bodyguard. To go back and do some much more. Just get different parts of your creative persona engaged and try and think of fresh solutions to something you don't know how to do. Whereas I suspect some people just always do the action movie or the romantic comedy, and they have a kind of style for that.
Safe place.
Do you still get scared? Do you still get scared when you, on that first day on set? Do you still feel a little bit sick?
I'm always nervous.
Yeah.
I think that's essential, isn't it? It's so important.
I find that very hard.
But notes are really important because they challenge us. And 7, 8 out of 10 notes are not going to be helpful. And so you recognise that. So it's in part how you deal with that. And I think if the people you're working with and the people who are financing what you're doing feel listened to and acknowledged, more than anything acknowledged. Listen, okay, so you're suggesting that. Okay, let's talk about that and I'll tell you why it won't work. And I'll tell you all the reasons it won't work. And then every so often, 9 times out of 10, 1 time out of 10, 2 times out of 10, they'll come up with something that is really genuinely helpful.
Yeah.
And you'd be an idiot not to embrace it and go, that's fabulous. That's really going to help me, because I'm so sort of fixed on this thing that you've just offered me something, and I'm grateful for that.
Yeah.
The trouble is when you get good notes rather than bad notes. Bad notes are obviously bad, and you find a polite way of saying, that's interesting, and I'll really try and do something. When they're good notes, I've worked with HBO, done a number of films for HBO in the States, and their notes are by and large excellent notes, and that's a real problem. You think, oh God, yeah, that's a good idea, that's a good idea. And you end up going down a pathway. I mean, it's an education, because it's a real conversation then between people who have a good creative grasp, not the creative team, which doesn't always have a good creative grasp. But they're good ideas, and they kind of stimulate you and help you make a better film sometimes. And they're difficult to deal with.
I'll ask you about Son of Saul, because it's really intense. It's very intense, and once you're in it, and you don't let us get out ever.
Sorry.
Which is fantastic. And you can, because you don't use many wides, you keep us there, and that's why I was there like this the whole time. And I'll throw this out. There's obviously a technical approach to doing something like that, because you want us to feel something emotionally, and our job is to also bring that bring a technical aspect to that, so that the audience is feeling something, not just by what the actors are doing, but what we're doing with the camera, where we're telling the fantastic DPs that we work with to put the camera. What made you say, this is how I want to do Son of Saul?
I wanted to convey something visceral to the audience, so it had to go through a certain channel of emotion, but it had to be created by technical means. And I think that's what's interesting in cinema, is that it's very down to earth and very not poetic in this way. It's just matter of factly. But how do you create with facts or objects? How do you create emotions? And I had to have a plan for it, and I had to stick to it. Otherwise, if it's not coherent, then I leave this path that we assigned ourselves, and if we left this path, and there's tremendous opportunity to leave this path, and had we done it, we would have had another film, which is not this film, and it's narrow in its scope and its approach, and it was hard to resist, all the temptations. Right. So I think it's also directing for me, at least. It's how you stay on that path. Always, it's interesting to take in other elements, but I think it's very important to have this coherence throughout the film.
You speak about a path, and in your movie, which I tried not to see while I was shooting my movie. I'd be too influenced by it and subconsciously plagiarize it. I didn't want to do that. But you use the path of the guy's face. You follow him. And the stuff that happens is dynamite stuff. It's really explicit stuff, but it happens soft focus behind him, or it comes and goes quickly through the frame, and it's happening off screen.
Yes.
Which I think works on the emotions.
You've
really.
seen it, yeah.
Yeah.
It's almost like you've seen it, although you haven't.
Well, I've seen the trailer, and I've read about it, and I want to see it, but no. But it's very charged territory to go into. The idea of filming the Holocaust is anathema to a lot of people. David Hare, who's the writer of the movie I did, and I had passionate arguments during the making of it. I wanted to dramatize quick flashes, almost subliminal, of the truth of what was underlying the court arguments. And he thought passionately that you shouldn't dramatize the Holocaust ever, period. That should be something that's just... Well, I'd found from my experience on Threads that there are some things you can't think about unless you have a visual image in your head. A lot of people can't think about nuclear war, for example, unless you show it to them, and can't think about the enormity of what happened in the Holocaust unless you give them something, some little gem, a grain of something.
Because you had that fantastic. There's a moment in Denial where it was terrifying, where you see them scrambling, and it's just a few frames, but it was enough. You know what I mean? Because it's a courtroom drama, and we're here with this ridiculous human being denying something that we all know that happened. You obviously would have met the real life lady that Rachel Weisz plays. How do you deal with that when you're creating something that, like, this is a true story? This is based on her story.
Well, I felt, the writer and I both felt this great burden on us that we were dealing with historical truth, and therefore it imposed a great restraint. It's probably the simplest film I've ever made in my 40 years of making movies. You know, I have a kind of energetic approach, handheld, let's get in there, and a visual approach. This was kind of very, very pared down, and the dialogue that's said in the courtroom was exactly what was said on the court record. We haven't invented anything, we've edited it slightly. Everything that we've ascribed to the villain of the piece, if you like, in quotes, David Irving, he said in speeches, in books, in articles, and interviews and things. So we haven't, we resisted the temptation. It was really great there to create a moment, an emotional movie moment here, an emotional movie moment here. We pulled back from that, so it's a very spare and austere film. In fact, we were talking about the narratives that we kind of find ourselves pulled into because of other movies. I mean, Erin Brockovich lies there in the background of this movie. That's a kind of Hollywood familiar trope. Someone who is a face in the crowd, Erin Brockovich, and Julia Roberts, is plucked out of anonymity, where she doesn't have a voice or articulacy or any particular talents. And through the course of the film, like in a Jimmy Stewart movie or a Henry Fonda movie, she acquires a voice, she acquires nobility and moral courage, and there's a great speech at the end that she makes, and everybody thinks, well, this was about a very accomplished woman, Deborah Livstadt, the heroine, who started out that way. Yeah. She was very articulate, very press savvy, very good at her job, her work, her knowledge, and a very pushy kind of person. So the kind of person that Julia Roberts ended up with, she started as, and through the movie she's silenced by her lawyers and told the only way we can win this case is if you say nothing. So that's quite the opposite of a dramatic arc, and everybody's expecting that to happen. So the challenge was to make that silence a heroic gesture, to make an act of self-denial, if you like.
Did you find that difficult, or was
it's really difficult to do, because everybody's expecting the opposite.
Yeah.
But there are tropes that you can use and not distort the truth of what you're trying to hew to. And one is a fish out of water. This is a woman who comes from America into the unfamiliar British legal system. And it's cold, and it's cold in London as opposed to Atlanta, where she comes from. It's cold emotionally. She thinks everybody is cold fishes and doesn't share her passion. So there's a dialogue between passionate intensity and emotion on the one hand as a language, and legal logic and strategy on the other, two kind of in conflict. So that it affects you the way you deal with the actors, I think, in the movie. You say, we're going to be very kind of restrained in the way we cover this, but you don't have to be restrained. In these conflicts areas, like when Irving invades her lecture and starts interrupting, speak over each other. Don't do do it for sound. You just do it. And when the lawyers have arguments among themselves, go for it. Go for it. We'll be able to cut it. It's all right. Don't worry about that. Which gives them a kind of emotional energy.
David, so Fantastic Beasts is obviously a massive beast of a film, and it's an area that you have experience in. But can I ask, if I may, when you were first asked to do something so huge, something as loved as Harry Potter, what was your process on that? Especially as Harry Potter had like 2 other directors, I believe, on some of the other films. So, which I found really interesting. And what was your approach to go, I'm going to make this one my film?
Well, you do everything from scratch. You know, you've got the script arrived from Joe, and it felt so different to everything that we'd done before in a way, because there were no kids, it was all grown-ups, and it had a sensibility and a tune and a musicality to it that it sort of echoed what she'd created before in terms of that world, but it just felt fresher. And you're right, when I did Potter, I kind of joined the train. It was halfway out the station.
Right.
So it was like being invited to a party and you bring your own booze. You know, I'm coming, I'll bring what I do. I'll bring, and before I did Order of the Phoenix, which was my first one, I'd done a TV show called Sex Traffic. Yeah. So I finished Sex Traffic, and I said, and they phoned me up and said, we want you to direct Harry Potter. And I said, I've just done it. But they wanted that slightly more grown up, intense kind of approach to the material. And when I read Fantastic Beasts, it felt resonant with interesting themes, and I was moved by the characters. And Chris Columbus found the kids for the Potters, and I was able to just create. What we do as directors is we cast everything.
Yeah.
We cast, the actors are crucial, you know, clearly, because they allow us to interpret everything. And then we cast our DOP, our costume designer, every member of, everyone who comes to build that world with you, you've decided upon, you know, to bring with you on that journey. And in my experiences, the people you give the fewest notes to, you've made the right choice.
Yeah.
And if you've got an actor you're sort of noting all the time, you've obviously maybe made not the most perfect step. So for me, it was partly coming home to work with in a world that I was sort of very fond of, but it felt very different and very fresh. And also the stories going forward that Joe's writing, they're all resonant with political themes and ideas, and my television work was full of, you know, dealt with politics quite a lot. So you know, it's really about the rise of the right. It's the rise of and the sort of seductive nature of power, and how all the sort of things that we take for granted are much more fragile than we realise. And that's ultimately, and she was developing that long before the last 12, 16 months, when so many of these things,
Right, yeah.
you know, and ironically, some of the things that she wrote in those early Potter books, that you kind of thought, well, this is kind of quaint, and sort of, you know, they're actually sort of starting to feel frighteningly
real. Yeah, I was just
in
like,
a strange way.
I think that's the case with all our films, isn't it? At the moment, they're dealing with this world which is much more fragile than we thought it was.
because yours. What I loved about Under the Shadows, because when I started watching your film, I had no idea that it was a horror film. I hope I'm not spoiling. I thought it was about the war.
Yeah.
So I was like, great, okay, you know, let's get in. I loved that it had a female lead, because you never see that you rarely see that with war films, and I must say the casting of the little girl, Dorsa.
We were very lucky. Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
I don't know. But what made your film has political undertones as well, which I found fascinating, because the moment we went into Horrorland, I was like, okay, we're in Horrorland. And then there's that fantastic moment where, you know, she's hearing noises, so she does what any of us would do, picks up her child, and she runs out the house, and she gets stopped by these
Moral
cops.
police, religious police.
And they were like,
Yeah.
why aren't you covered? And I was like, why aren't you covered? There's a ghost in her house, you know what I mean? And I thought that was a brilliant scene, because it wasn't too long, it was just there to tell us, to remind us the world that we're in.
Yeah.
What made you decide to do something like that?
Well,
To mix politics with horror?
Well, I think it came naturally with the setting, because I think all of us here are first and foremost storytellers, and then for me, I think the subtext and the themes come after. So first, I think, you know, I never wanted any of these themes to be heavy-handed or on the nose, but because I chose Iran in the 80s, you know, wartime, post-revolution, and the main character was a woman, you know, in this world that is rapidly changing around her. It just, you know, all those like little moments or the themes that you mentioned, it just came naturally, to be honest with you. It just felt like, oh, this is a great opportunity to sort of explore these themes. And the plan was always to start the film almost feeling like a social realist drama, you know, kind of like paying homage to a lot of Iranian filmmakers, because that's cinema of Iran is known for, like, you know, the social realist sort of dramas. And then bit by bit, as we enter the main character's head, and as she starts unraveling and the world around her starts unraveling, you know, the style becomes more and more like expressionist, and you know, so yeah, that was always like, I thought it would be an interesting way to tell this story, and hopefully if you go there watching it fresh like you did,
Yeah.
you know, when it starts off you think you're in a completely different world, and then bit by bit it shifts. But you know, the plan was to make the shift as seamlessly as possible. I don't know if I succeeded or not, but that's up to the audience
You
to
did.
decide. Yeah.
So they mentioned a gin. I was like, gin, I've heard of a gin. But it was just like, and then certain things, and I was like, oh my God. Who were the directors, or what was the film that inspired you to make film? That made you say, I want to be a director? Not what made you love film, that made you say, I want to direct.
Who?
That's for everybody.
Everybody.
Okay, a movie called The Cruel Sea. When I was a kid, I would go to our local Art Deco movie palace every Saturday morning, and for sixpence, you could see two movies. Wow. One was a big movie that was running that week, and the other was an old war movie. And this is a movie in 1953. Every movie was a war movie then. It was shortly after the end of World War II. It was a story about a Captain Jack Hawkins, great English actor, and he's in charge of an escort vessel in the North Atlantic, escorting oil tankers across and getting sunk by U-boats and things. And there's a scene in which he's hunting a submarine that's sinking the tankers. And it's this, I've never felt such emotion sitting in a movie seat as in that one scene where you can hear the ping of the sonar detecting the submarine, and you can hear the voices of everybody around him on the bridge, and you're on his face. And in the water are the survivors of a previous sinking, and it becomes clear that the submarine is underneath the men who are floating in the water. And he has the means to destroy the submarine with the power of his ship, or to rescue the men. And he gets closer and closer and closer to the men in the water, and the ping is going ping-a, ping-a, ping, and someone's saying, contact 500 yards ahead, sir. And I thought, if you can do that with film, you can move people so they're sitting on the edge of their seat. I want to do that.
Oh, wow.
Singing in the Rain.
Next. This is my favourite.
Well, very like mine.
A couple quickly. Ken Loach's film. Loved Ken Loach's work because it reflected a world I grew up in. So it was the world that I knew, so it felt very real and authentic. And Jaws, because Steven Spielberg, completely contrary to anything Ken Loach does, because I sat in a theatre with 300 people and experienced a communal sort of set of emotions that was profound and wonderful and exciting. And I shared that with all these strangers in the dark. I loved it.
And you were like, I want to do that.
I want to do that.
Yeah, I want to do that.
I have a similar one to David. At 10, 11, I was watching Spielberg films and Tim Burton films religiously, and I thought, I want to do this. It was only later that I found my other idols like Loomis and Kubrick and blah, blah, but it was Spielberg and Tim Burton.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us.